Welcome back to We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and the skills to love better so you can live better. If you've ever tried to find a therapist, you know that the process is not exactly therapeutic. You are expected to open up about your deepest wounds to a complete stranger. But before you even get to that point, you're Googling names, you're scrolling through Psychology Today bios, and hoping that anyone is taking new clients. Or worse, maybe you landed on the therapist that you want, and now you're just hoping that they email you back. It is stressful, it is overwhelming, and it's no wonder that people email me every week for help finding a therapist. People say that any therapy is better than no therapy, but I disagree. I've seen people in my personal life go to the wrong therapist, and those therapists enabled some really fucked up dynamics. All of which is to say that finding the right therapist can be so hard that it makes you want to give up. Like the way sometimes online dating makes you want to give up. But don't, because I have a resource for you. Today, we're talking to Dr. Sarah Coe Otis, a licensed clinical psychologist who works at Harvard's Mass General as well as in her own private practice. Sarah is basically the therapist matchmaker of Instagram. You DM her, you tell her what you want help with, and she cuts through all the noise to find you the kind of therapist that you need. And she does it for free. So whether you're starting out therapy for the first time or you're realizing that your current therapist is not very effective, this episode is going to give you all the resources that you need to get what you came for. So let's get into it. Let me start by asking you what you think about therapy apps.
I will start by saying that I am all for increasing accessibility to mental health care, right? We are in a mental health crisis right now. We need more therapists. We need more ways for people to access therapists. But with that being said, I think it's really, really important to make sure that the care people are receiving is quality and ethical. And I often have concerns about both the quality and the ethics of a lot of therapy apps. So some popular therapy apps are problematic on both these fronts. So there was one prominent therapy app a few years ago that got in trouble for sharing sensitive health information on users with advertisers.
You got to be fucking kidding me.
Nope.
What?
Nope. It came out. The Federal Trade Commission caught them. They had to pay all existing users because they were basically selling sensitive information to advertisers. So presumably that has been rectified. But for me, once you have an ethical breach like that, I'm very wary, and
Your
I
brand,
think that
your brand integrity is just destroyed to me.
Right. And I think a lot of the apps honestly run on the premise that people are so desperate for mental health care that either they don't know about these ethical breaches in the past or it feels like their only option so they can continue to get users. On the quality side, there's no vetting process for therapists to become providers on these apps. So early this morning, I went to one of the apps. I wanted to see how easy it would be to become a provider. It took me 2 minutes. I entered my name, my license number, my email address, and my phone number, and there I was able to make a profile.
All you need is a license to practice.
All
and
you
be
need
on
is
there.
a license, right? To me, that's a little bit concerning. And I want to make it clear that I'm sure there are quality therapists on a lot of these apps.
Yes.
But there's also going to be a huge range. And so I often have concerns about how do we know that people are receiving quality care? I think the intents are good, but I'm often wary about them. I think there's one other type of therapy app that's becoming more and more prominent now that is a little bit different. So there's an emergence of evidence-based apps that provide therapy without a live therapist. And so, for example, I work in a lab at a Harvard Medical School affiliated hospital that studies evidence-based apps to help people with specific disorders. And I think the evidence-based is really important. What that basically means is that they are focused on therapies that substantial research has been conducted to prove the efficacy of the therapy. They are researched the actual apps themselves before becoming public to make sure that people don't have problems, that they're benefiting from them. And a lot of them are also FDA approved. Those, I think there can be sometimes some concerns with them in terms of what happens if someone has suicidal thoughts and they don't have someone to contact because they're not conducting therapy with a live therapist.
Fair concern.
But I think that there's a difference between evidence-based apps to help with specific mental health concerns and these platforms where anyone can become therapists and you have no idea what, what their training is, what their expertise is, and how quality they are.
I will also add to that conversation of concerns, and I want to just like acknowledge for our listeners that it sounds like Sarah and Darcy are both in private practice. And of course, we would have reasons to find critique with the therapy apps. Yes, and I can find a critique in a stop sign. I can find a typo in a stop sign. And it is imperative that we look at these tools critically. So I did a podcast episode maybe 6 months ago with my niece, and I did my own research, and I will just shout out the name of the app. It was BetterHelp. I wanted to see what they were paying clinicians. And it turned out that they were paying their video editors $20 more an hour than the $45 or $42 an hour they were paying their therapists. I want our listeners to hear that you come out of school. I think the average degree for a master's degree, which is that's below the degrees that you and I have.
Right.
We both have PhDs. They weren't necessary it wasn't necessary for me to practice because I had a master's in social working. That's a licensable level of practice at the master's level. So the lowest level of education that somebody needs to be a therapist is a master's degree. And the average school the average school in America is like $99,000 or something like that.
Right.
That's the kind of debt we walk away with because most of us aren't trust fund kids. And then to take a job where you could have gotten that job had you wanted to be a video editor, not only without a master's degree, but maybe if you're a great editor, you could have done it without, like, I don't know, when I'm looking for an editor, I don't care what their degree is. I care what their skill level is. So you're able to, the point is that nobody with self-worth, I think, is jumping into those apps unless they are desperate for money. And that's usually at the beginning or the ends of their careers. And you guys can come for me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Sure, caseloads dip, they ebb and flow. And maybe you have some like 5 hours a week that you want to fill in, but that's not the majority of people on these apps. They're at the beginnings of their career, usually not the ends, because at the ends we have a technological learning curve that people usually don't want to bridge. So it's usually brand new therapists on these apps. What about the idea of texting doing therapy through text?
So I was actually going to mention that. And if you're willing to call out BetterHelp, I'm willing to call out BetterHelp. BetterHelp was the app that had that breach a couple years ago.
Yeah, I'm not working for them. I mean, they hit me up literally twice, 3 times a month. Every therapy app tries to recruit every therapist. They just literally buy the log of who's licensed in an area. And I am definitely the wrong girl to hit up because I am on the other end of the spectrum in terms of what I charge for my fees. But please, when you use a therapy app to text your therapist, you're doing text therapy.
So I think it's concerning on many levels. The first is that a lot of these apps promise the ability to text your therapist 24/7.
That is insane.
When you're getting paid the amount that these therapists are getting paid, well, they're getting paid to be accessible 24/7. And so a lot of reviews that you see will say, I texted my therapist and I didn't hear back in a week. And it's like, well, yeah, when you're not getting paid fairly, why would you want to respond to people in the middle of the night on the weekend outside of business hours? So that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think therapy should be conducted via text. I have a strict policy with my clients that if they have a last minute scheduling concern and need me to see it, or there's some kind of emergency, they can text me. I don't save any kind of client contacts in my phone. And I tell them, all therapy should be conducted in an appointment. If you have a question, emailing me is the most secure. text should be really if it's urgent, and I use it very, very sparingly. So the idea that people are using text as a form of therapy is concerning, not only in terms of confidentiality and privacy, but also there's liability risk there. And I think it's really concerning. I don't know how anyone could be backing the ability to allow therapists to text their clients and vice versa. Not to mention, it's important to teach boundaries.
Right. And how to manage your own discomfort in between
Yeah.
appointments,
Yeah.
you know? So my whole goal is to keep my clients out of a crisis. I don't know about you,
Yes,
Sarah, but
I agree.
that's my jam. I get paid to see around corners to predict when, give my clients, well, if you do this, here's what I see as the three most likely consequences. Of course, they're going to do whatever they want to do, but my goal is to let them know, I'm pretty sure this is leading to a negative consequence.
Yeah.
Here's how I see this playing out, but do what you're going to do. I'm here to support you, no matter what. So if you're in a situation where you're actually incentivized to be available after hours because your client is going to be in a crisis, and then
Yeah.
you're going to get additional pay, I think that's problematic in the business plan as well. But it used to be, I remember, this is long before your time, I think, but I came of age right as managed care became a thing. Before managed care, everybody had insurance that would cover, out of network therapy, or they private paid for it. And you could be, you had access to just about every therapist because you would get reimbursement from your insurance. Something happened, I forget if it was the 80s or the 90s, but like I came of age in the late 90s, and we used to have these concerns about people who were in insurance networks. And now I'm like, it may not be the gold standard, but that's what you're looking for as a baseline. That's a much better entry point for services than the therapy apps, I think.
I totally agree. And I think a lot of it is that there's people have such a lack of knowledge on where to even start looking for a therapist, right? They'll listen to a podcast and hear an ad from a BetterHelp or something like that, and that's how they hear about therapy. Or, they'll do a Google search and there are paid ads at the top of Google that advertise these. And I think we really, as an industry, need to increase the transparency of how to find a quality therapist and what a quality therapist looks like, because it's typically not going those routes, but that's what feels most accessible and easiest for most people.
And I will say, full disclosure, one of our sponsors is a mental health company that provides mental health services. It's not app based.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't allow an app based. It wouldn't matter how much money. Do you know how wealthy I could be if I took every opportunity that's been given to me, even just in the last 10 years, to do things that are a little shady or a little walking the line of ethics? I would be so loaded. I'd be able to give my services away for free. I will not allow an app to advertise on the podcast. I won't allow it because I don't believe in it. I will only allow products that I have personally tried, or whose owners I know and whose service providers I know. But coming back to texting your therapist, if you just look at this, forget therapy. If you just look at this from the perspective of, like, when you're texting a friend and you're heated, you're escalated,
Yeah.
how likely is that conversation to miss the mark because there are so many miscommunications through text because we have not evolved to be able to understand affect? Well, first of all,
Right.
text is devoid of affect, so there's nothing to deconstruct affect wise in a text message. But it's the one thing I tell people in terms of dating and relationships. Like, texting is great for facts, like you said. If you have like a scheduling emergency, if you're running late, if your computer's not working or whatever, your car broke down, fine to text Sarah, fine to text me. Don't text me questions about how
Yeah.
to handle a situation. That's not appropriate for texting. And in part because it's devoid of boundaries, but moreover because the likelihood that you're going to hear me wrong, or I'm going to deliver the information in a way that I don't intend, is enormous. We know that the research on virtual therapy says that it's as effective as in person, but are there some people who should specifically look for in person therapy?
Yes, I think so. And I will admit that I was a complete skeptic at the beginning of COVID when everything turned to virtual. And I am, by and large, bought into the idea that virtual therapy is just as effective as in person therapy. I do think there's something really nice about in person therapy because you can pick up on nonverbal cues. You can feel kind of tangible emotion in the room. There's a more personal connection, but it doesn't make a big difference for everyone. The people who it does make a big difference for are sometimes people want a neutral location to be able to speak about personal things, right? I have had clients who say, I don't want my bedroom where I am relaxing, where I'm sleeping, where I'm decompressing, where I'm experiencing intimacy to be the same place that I'm talking about deeply personal issues, right? So I think for people who feel like having a neutral space would make them more comfortable talking, that's a big reason to come to in-person therapy. I think the second is people who don't have privacy at home, right? The
Mm,
ability to have a space at home or at work where you feel like you can speak openly without being interrupted and without people overhearing you is kind of
it's
a
ever
luxury. And
it's
I
but
think
it's
it's,
also the foundation, it's the
yes,
cornerstone of
yes.
therapy.
Yes. Right. And so often I'll see college students who live in a dorm and feel like
Yep.
people could be passing through at any time, or a parent with a bunch of young kids who feel like kids could be walking in at any time. So, the ability to have a private space is another reason to come to in-person therapy. I think the third big reason is people who are easily distracted. I can't tell you how many times I will be in a therapy session with someone and see in the reflection of the person's glasses that
Yeah,
they are
they're
browsing the internet
they're
or I hear them
multitasking. You hear them.
typing.
Yeah. And
And
also we're like our eyes at this point, 5 years into COVID,
yeah,
we all know when one another is glancing at
yes,
the clock on our computers because we all know
yes,
it's in the upper right-hand corner. Um, and we all know what it looks like when somebody is not fully present.
yes.
So, yeah, I agree. If you're someone who's easily distracted or you struggle with ADHD and you don't have that locked down yet, then in person
Yeah.
is more appropriate.
I will say the one other situation, and this is a little more niche, is for example, I specialize in OCD. It's one of the disorders that I work with, the most commonly. And I specifically do a type of therapy called exposure and response prevention. And it is totally effective at home. But for example, some people might have contamination based OCD. And so the ability to be in person with them and be able to go throughout the office, throughout the waiting room, down the street and be able to do exposures with the person that they might not have in the comfort of their own home during a therapy session can be
Mhm.
very beneficial. But by and large, research indicates that there is no significant difference for most disorders between virtual and in person therapy.
Yeah, I think those are some important distinctions. By the way, I did not know you specialize in OCD. That is one of the only things I will not touch. Not one of the only things. I mean, I have a short list of things I won't touch, but now I know who to refer to for that because that is definitely something I am always looking for somebody to refer out for that. FYI. Um what are the biggest red flags that people miss when they're choosing a therapist, especially in an Instagram, social media world where everybody is, they've got their filters on and they all know the talking points to sound trauma informed and fabulous.
Yes. So I think there are a few things. I think the biggest thing, and this might be a little cynical to say, is there's a difference between being trauma informed and being a trauma specialist.
Mhm.
Anyone can say they're trauma informed, right? Just like I often see people's like Psychology Today profiles or something like that that say they do cognitive behavioral therapy. What that really means is they might have taken a class or two on CBT, right? So I think there are a few things. I think in the Instagram world, there's a huge difference between liking someone's content and thinking someone would be a good fit for you as a therapist. And the amount of likes that someone gets or how funny their reels are or whatever it might be does not actually equate to either being a quality therapist or, more importantly, being a good fit. When on my Instagram, I make a big point not to promote this as this is my Instagram for my private practice, because I really want to separate the information that I'm trying to disseminate about mental health care and how to access mental health care versus my role in private practice as a psychologist, right? So I think if people are trying to blur the lines between promoting their services and providing Instagram content, I think that that's a red flag. I think, too, if we zoom outside of um, Instagram and look at places like Psychology Today, I think that there are also a lot of red flags. So for those who don't know, Psychology Today is probably the most common website that people can go to find therapists and psychiatrists. And in a lot of the work I do of helping people find therapists, I'll often do a preliminary search on Psychology Today as well as a few other websites. And I can't tell you how many people I see on there who say that they specialize in 20 different disorders and do 15 different types of therapy. Their checkboxes, there's no maximum number that you can check. One thing I can tell you is if someone is specializing in 20 things or doing 15 types of therapy, they're not doing any of it well. Right?
They're
So
right.
I
They're
think
they're a
that sometimes,
generalist.
yes, yes. So I think that that is often a big red flag for me, is that you can't be a specialist in a ton of different things. And so I think when people advertise themselves that way, it feels a little misguided to me. And to me, it feels like they're just trying to attract as many clients as possible. Um,
100%.
I think the other really important thing to be thinking through is that there's huge risk in taking an account with a lot of followers and assuming that that means it's a safe source of information, right? A lot of mental health based Instagram accounts are people who might still be in school or in training, or people who have experienced a specific disorder generally, right? And I think I love that we are taking big strides towards disseminating information about mental health care and destigmatizing going to therapy. I love that. I'm all for that. I believe in meeting people where they're at. And in this day and age, it's on social media. But I think we really need to examine the sources that we are consuming this information from and the validity of what they're saying, and not just take everything as face value. People will often send me Instagram posts that they think I'll like because it's mental health related. And it's really sweet, but I look at it and I'm like, where is this coming from?
Literally,
There's no credible source. And I think that that's quite concerning.
oftentimes they're not even therapists, they're coaches,
Yeah.
talking outside of their lane. I mean, coaching has a lane. It's a very important profession, but it's not the same as a therapist. And I've said it before, and I'll be screaming this until we do something from a regulatory standpoint as mental health practitioners. The best therapists make it look effortless, just like when you watch Simone Biles, they make
Yeah.
she makes her flips look totally reasonable. You don't see the number of years and hours that have gone into that. And so when you're a recipient of really good therapy, and then you think you can just rinse and repeat that because you have some marketing experience, or you're like really great on social media, and then you start disseminating that information. The liability, well, there is no liability because it's not a regulated profession.
Right.
And it's very frustrating to me. I will say, what do you think about, so back to like, who is a credible therapist, and how do you determine the bullshit from the real credentials of a therapist on their
Yeah.
bio? What about just asking them, do you have a certification? Specifically, a certification. I see that you check CBT. Do you have a certification in that? Like, different from a CEU, continuing education unit, which
Yes.
we're all required to do as professionals who have
Yeah.
licenses. Every year we need a certain amount of these credits so people can say they were trained in, they took a course in. A CEU is not a fucking course, people. It is a 2 to 9 to 12 hour requirement for us to maintain our licenses. That does not mean we are certified in something or should be holding ourselves out as having that certification. Years ago, I had a therapist in the throes of my own PTSD who wanted to do EMDR on me. I wouldn't let her do it. I didn't know why. I just wasn't down for it. It felt too vulnerable. Years later, 5 years later, I got my own EMDR therapy, and it was so powerful that I went and I did my own training, and as I was emerging from that training, the training that resulted in the certification, as I was emerging from that, I looked up the therapist to see if she was certified, and no, she was not certified. So if I'm like, my guts were hanging out of me, you guys, at the time. I was like not the walking wounded. I was not mobile. I was like, I should have been I should have taken a sabbatical. And if I had had the ability, I would have taken a sabbatical. I should have taken time off. And I did subsequently take a couple weeks off. It wasn't enough, but I did get it together. The point is that like, had I allowed that therapist to do EMDR on me, I don't know what kind of shape I would have been in.
Yeah.
EMDR is one of those tools that seems so simplistic, and when you know how to use it, it actually is. But to do it right is an art form, and you have to use it all the time to be proficient at it. You can't have weeks or months in between using it and expect to be great at it, just like anything else. And she had taken a CEU course in EMDR and checked that box or verbalized to me that she felt confident doing EMDR on me. And thankfully, I didn't volunteer to let her do that because I couldn't have taken any more hardship. So if somebody were to ask the therapist, hey, I see on your profile that you say that you do CBT. Are you certified in it? Do you think that would lead to a more informed decision?
I think so. And I think clients should feel empowered to ask these questions, right? They are receiving a service that should be a right to everyone. Like right now, I think unfortunately it's a privilege for a lot of people, but it should be a right. And just like any other right, you deserve to know what you're getting into, right? For a lot of people, therapy is very expensive. It requires time, it requires vulnerability, it requires emotion. Um, you deserve to know what you're getting. If someone says to me, oh, you say you specialize in X, Y, and Z, or you do this type of therapy. What type of training do you have on that? I applaud them and I want them to be my client because
I
I
love
want
that
my
question
clients,
myself. Yes, I want an
you know,
informed consumer.
yes. And so I think that asking what kind of training, how long have you specialized in this, asking people something like, what percentage of your clients do you do EMDR with, right? Because I'm
Mhm.
curious, if she took one training, she might not be doing it with 80%. She might be, are you her first person who she's ever done it with? Are you her 17th? You know, I think these are really important questions. And if a therapist responds poorly to those questions, to be quite honest, that probably means that they're not legitimately providing the care that they say they're providing and therefore are not a good fit. I mean, I truly think, and I'm, sound like a broken record here, that there are so many ways for people, whether intentionally or not, and I choose to believe that most people it's not intentionally, are unethical with the way that they are presenting themselves as therapists
I
because they
agree.
have this freedom without any kind of regulations to say that they can
Mhm.
do this, that, and the other.
I agree. I mean, listen, before my wife, Steph, was certified as a couples therapist, I'm going to raise my hand and say I was one of those people who said I would work with couples. Then I watched what she went through to be certified. I was like, oh, I don't know anything about this shit. That took years. It took so
Yeah.
much effort. It took so many exams. She had to like record herself with couples who had to volunteer to let them to waive confidentiality so that she could get certified in this. And there are different ways of doing that. And I saw that process. I took that right off and I never regretted it. Took it right off my
Yeah.
profile. So I think it is imperative. One of my favorite questions from a new client or a prospective client is, so you're telling me that I struggle with, I don't know, depression. What kind of homework assignments or what would the
Yeah.
strategy be? How would you approach your work with me? I love that question because I can actually articulate that. in a very no nonsense, understandable way. And I'm not saying that
Yeah.
because I'm trying to flex. I'm saying that because it took me decades to be able to articulate that. And I am so excited to be able to give you that
Yeah.
if you're curious about that so that you can see how I would be thinking about this. I mean, you would see it anyway if we were working together because I always ask my clients, does that sound like a good idea or a dumb idea or somewhere in between?
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts before I give them any goals or any homework assignments. I say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think about that? So it's always a joint decision, but I love somebody who's curious and skeptical enough to
Yeah.
ask that important question. It's imperative.
Totally. And I also love well, let me say this. I, at this point, require essentially that every potential client has a free 15-minute phone consultation with me before
Mhm.
starting, right?
Yep.
And anyone out there, you can and should ask any potential therapist to speak to them for 15 minutes for free, to see if it's a good fit. And when people say to me, I don't need to talk to you, I just want to sign up for therapy, I say to them, I can't force you to talk to me on the phone, but I would really prefer it because we both want to make sure it's a good fit, right?
Yeah.
I want to make sure it's a good fit and they want to, right? I don't want
Yep.
someone to sign up for therapy without knowing what working with me is going to look like, without knowing what, if we have common goals for therapy. I think these types of questions like, do you give homework assignments? What is your typical length of a course of therapy? What does
Yes.
therapy with you look like? These things are so important. And I think people are timid to ask them often because they want to create a good impression.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, most therapists, at least the therapists that I want to associate with, value those types of questions. They're not repelled by them. They want those and they're excited by those questions.
Absolutely. Support for this episode comes from Mindful Care. Right now, it feels like the cracks in our society have grown deeper. Political polarization, economic uncertainty, and constant stress can leave anyone feeling stuck. Mindful Care offers same day access to expert clinicians and personalized treatments to help you feel like yourself again. And they accept all types of insurance, so support is just a call or a text away. Contact Mindful Care at 516-505-7200 or visit mindful.care to book your appointment today. So, how do you prioritize finding someone with the right vibe and chemistry versus someone with the right credentials? The research, just for our listeners to hear, um, frustratingly underscores that the most
Yeah.
predictive element of a good outcome of therapy is the extent to which the client, the patient, and the therapist have a good relationship.
Yes.
That frustrates me because I work so hard on my skills. I work so hard on staying abreast of the research, and I'm like, "It's my personality? Who the hell" I don't even know who would see me for my personality because I just think I'm a lot, and but that I'm like, my personality, I think that's the pill that the medicine they take to be able to get to the tools and skills. So the research tells us that the relationship is the most important part, which speaks to the vibe. So what say you, Sarah? Vibe versus credentials?
So I think it's a mixed bag. You have no idea how many people will contact me asking for help finding a therapist, and they say to me, I only want a PhD. I only want a social worker. I only want an LMFT. And they are so specific about it. Most of them don't have reasons why, right? Sometimes someone will say, I'm in school for social work and I want someone who understands, what I'm going through or something like that. I think when we're talking about credentials, if we're talking about degrees, a degree does not equate to quality. I think
Mhm.
it's important to put that out there, right? There are things like you and I have PhDs. We went to too many years of school,
Yep.
you know.
Still
Um,
paying. How about you?
it's exorbitant. And so there is something about certain degrees or certain programs might mean that you have more specific training, more years, more clinical hours before becoming licensed. I think that is legitimate. So if people say to me, I don't want someone who's super newly licensed, I can
Right.
understand that, right? So putting that aside, I think it's important to differentiate between a degree and quality. Like you said, research really does indicate that therapeutic alliance is one of the most important indicators, if not the most important indicator of effectiveness of therapy. I think when it comes to the question of vibe versus expertise, it largely depends on the client's goals of coming to therapy. And I'm curious if you agree with this. If someone wants general support, is looking for talk therapy, I think vibe is far and beyond the most important thing.
Yep, I agree with you.
I think with that being said, if someone is coming for a specific disorder, vibe is still incredibly important. But it's also important for them to be doing therapy with someone providing an evidence-based treatment or an empirically supported treatment for that specific disorder, right? Because I have seen people who have received a specific type of therapy for a disorder in which there's no empirical basis to suggest that that type of therapy can help that disorder. And it can actually be detrimental in certain
Yep.
situations,
Yes.
right? So I think that if you're seeking therapy for a specific disorder, look up what types of therapies are warranted for that specific type of disorder. And there's actually a great website out there. It's div12.org/treatments that lists for virtually any type of disorder, every empirically supported treatment for that disorder. So start there by finding what types of treatments make sense for what I'm seeking therapy for. And then from there, find someone who matches your vibe or who you feel comfortable with.
For example, if you know that you've just experienced trauma or you have trauma that you want to
Yeah.
reprocess, talk therapy is not your first line of treatment. That should not be your first line of treatment. And there's very easy to understand research out there that explains why talk therapy. You want a certified trauma therapist, somebody who works with trauma, is certified in it, like steeped. They braised themselves in the research, in the method, in the practice of it. To get certified in EMDR, I think it took me 7 years. I got my PhD in 5.
Wow.
I got my PhD faster than I got my certification in EMDR. Getting these certifications is hell. It's really, really hard to do, in part because it's not very structured and it's often, at the therapist's own pace. But it was a whole rigmarole to get certified in EMDR, and it took me 7 years. So it's really important that people really vet what it is. And again, we're talking about informed consumers, informed clients. Also, someone like you, someone like they come to the two of us, we're going to direct them in the right place. I will not take somebody who has OCD. That's not my jam. It wouldn't matter how much money they could pay me. I don't work with that. I'm so glad I know someone who does. You.
Send them
So
my way.
I shall. So, what are a few green flags in a first session that might suggest that the therapist is actually a really good long-term fit? We've talked a lot about red flags. What are some green
Yeah.
flags that you're in space with the right person?
So I think one big green flag is transparency about someone's style and approach, right? I want someone in an intake appointment, if not in an initial consultation, to be saying this is what therapy looks like, to be explaining those things that we talked about, whether they provide homework, whether they typically are oriented toward shorter term or longer term care. I mean, I'm very much of the attitude that the goal of therapy is to become one's own therapist.
100%.
And from session number 1, you are already working toward terminating and ending with
Yep.
that therapist. And so green flags are talking about that. Green flags are asking the client, what are your specific goals? Not this is what I do for therapy or this is what I work on for people. What are your goals? And also looking for tangible ways to be assessing whether together as the therapist and the client, you are working toward meeting those goals, right? I think often we talk about goals and they're these really vague, lofty terms, but I think it's a big green flag, in my opinion, for a
100%.
therapist to be laying out, how do we know if you're meeting those goals, right? Are we just hoping?
Goal setting, by the way, is a very tricky thing. It's not something that a
Yeah.
brand new therapist, we're all taught how to
Yeah.
do it in school. Nobody can do it when they come out of school. It is very hard because clients can't articulate what a goal looks like. Forget a SMART goal, a very specific goal. They often don't know they'll talk about what they don't want. So, what does the flip of that look like? So,
Yeah.
it's really, really important that your therapist be able to take your pain points and the things you want and craft those into buckets of goals, and then be able to tell you how to bridge the gap, where they begin the work to bridge the gap, and how will they know when they get there? Because
Yeah.
it doesn't matter how vague or lofty a goal is, there are ways to qualify them, to define
Yeah.
them in a way so that at a specific date, 60 days down the road, 90 days down the road, we are going to have a session where what we do is we examine this goal and we
Yes.
measure it. And if we don't hit it, that's just information. It's not a shaming moment for either of us. It means things need to be tweaked. You have to evaluate to know what to change.
I totally agree with that. I think also, and this should be given, a therapist showing a genuine interest in getting to know you, um, and asking thoughtful questions, right? Not having kind of like a checklist of questions that it seems like they're just running through. I've heard people feel like an intake appointment is like an interview. And I
Yeah.
don't think it should be like that. Sure, there are questions that we want to get through in an intake appointment, right? We need to assess for risk. We want to understand background. There are things that we want to get to. But for
Mhm.
me, a green flag is feeling like it's a genuine conversation.
Yeah.
I do think, too, so it's important to note, and I'm always floored by the statistic, that the most common number of therapy appointments is one. Research shows that the most common, like if you look across the board, across all degrees, the most common number, the mode, is one appointment, which is wild to me.
I'm
Uh,
dumbfounded. My jaw's to the ground. Sarah, I've never had a one-off.
no,
In my whole career, I've never had somebody come once and not come back.
and yeah, so it's astounding to me. I think that it might raise some level of concern about like who are these therapists that are getting one intake. I think also a lot of going to therapy is scary,
Mhm.
right? Acknowledging that you need help, that you want help, talking to someone who doesn't know you is extremely scary, right? So I think there's some people who might just say that was too much, that was exhausting, I don't know what I just did, I just disclosed really personal things, and then want to just leave.
And I
But
would
I
argue
think there's
that
also
that's on the therapist for allowing
yes, that's what yeah,
a level of disclosure that they didn't earn the
yes,
right to hear. We are trained, you guys, therapists are trained to control the amount of information that you disclose to us so that you don't have an incapacitating vulnerability hangover after the first session. I don't want your whole life story in the consult.
totally.
I do kind of get it in the assessment, and we are all trained to do assessments. The number of
Yeah,
people who don't do assessments, I've never
it's
had one,
disgusting.
and I've had 5 or 6 long-term therapists. How about you, Sarah? Have you ever been
Nope, I
assessed?
don't. Nope.
I
And
mean,
it's so weird as a psychologist to be like, what are you doing? But
like, literally, you know that you're working with a
yes,
therapist and you're not gonna
yes,
assess me? You're
yes,
jumping right in? You're gonna take a year and a half to know my major life events. And
yes,
every time I have to backfill you on a story, it's going to feel dysregulating to me and like we ruptured our flow
yes,
because you didn't get that shit out of the way session 1. It's boring. The assessment is the most boring part of my work, but I have to do it.
yes,
And it's a long, tedious, and I prepare my client. Look, I'm going to literally be reading off of a form. It's the last time I'll ever do it, but I have to do it because every time I think I know the answer to something, I wind up being wrong. So I have to ask the
totally.
questions as if I don't know, because guess what? I don't.
And it makes them trust us more. It makes them feel like we know what we're doing, that we are trying to understand, that we are being comprehensive, that we're not jumping to conclusions. It's yeah, I mean, I like to think that any program teaches these things, but it feels like once someone has the degree, they just feel like they can go off and do whatever is easiest or most convenient or I don't know what.
Yeah, it's the two bookends of therapy. They don't terminate. When a client wants to end therapy, we're supposed to go through a process called termination. I call it completion. Termination sounds
Yeah.
really negative to me. Call me woke. And I go through this process where we evaluate our work and we collect all the tools that worked and we put them in a toolbox in whatever form works best for that client's learning style, and then a plan for how they're going to continue their work once they're done with me.
Yeah.
It's the most basic training of therapy. You do an assessment and you do this termination at the end. And I only had that imposed on me once out of 5 or 6 long-term therapists. How about you?
I don't know that I've ever had it, to be honest.
Wow. It was a psychologist who imposed it on me, and I was glad that she did.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a therapy session that is just uncomfortable, because we all know that growth hurts,
Yeah.
and one that's genuinely unhealthy or even harmful?
Yeah. So therapy is hard and therapy is uncomfortable, right? When people say to me, I love therapy, I love hearing that because we want people to love that. Like, I love doing therapy, right? Like, I like that. But part of me is kind of like, what are you working on in therapy that makes you love it, right? And I think a lot of people mean they love the change that comes from therapy. But therapy, by and large, sitting in a therapy appointment typically isn't fun most of the time, right?
Mhm.
Because we're hitting on pain points. Otherwise, why would
Yeah.
the person be there? And I tell people, like, if it wasn't hard, you wouldn't be here. If it wasn't hard to work on these things, you and I probably also wouldn't have a job. But I think that a therapist's role is to encourage you to think about the uncomfortable and to consider things outside of the perspectives that you might currently hold or to reorient your thoughts. But a therapist should never, ever pressure someone to talk about something that they don't feel ready or comfortable to talk about. They
Mhm.
should never push the client to do something that goes against the client's values. And they should never explicitly tell the client what to do. Right. So I think that sometimes talking about hard things can be uncomfortable, but it's harmful when someone feels pressured by a therapist, feels like if I don't do this or say this, I'm going to be letting my therapist down. Your goal
Mhm.
in therapy is not to make your therapist proud. Like,
No.
that's just not your goal. And I think that it can be really important to take a values based approach and think, what are the values that are important to me in therapy? And there's a clear difference between discomfort that leads to the client's ultimate goals and that discomfort that leads to progress versus discomfort that's misaligned with what someone really wants. So when someone says to me, I don't really believe this, but my therapist told me this, to me, that feels harmful. I actually once, when I was single, had someone who I was dating say to me, my therapist told me that you and I should talk about X. And I was floored by that because, in my opinion, a therapist should not be telling someone, you need to talk about this with the person that you're dating. Right. So
But
I
don't
think
you
what,
but don't you feel like a lot of clients use that as their fuel source to articulate things that they don't feel like they have agency to articulate anyway?
sure,
My
sure. So,
therapist thinks, my therapist said, my therapist wants me to.
yeah, but I think I would push back on that and say that you should not know what your therapist wants you to do. Right. Because what I, as a therapist, want someone to do is to take steps to get to the goals that they have articulated to me. Right. I am never trying to impose my own thoughts onto someone else. So if a client knows what I specifically believe on a topic, to me, I'm starting to evaluate, how am I doing as a therapist and why are my thoughts on this topic really filtering into the therapy session and impacting what the client thinks or feels. I don't know. Do you disagree with that?
I do. You're looking at me and I'm looking very skeptical. I do disagree. I think that your approach is a conservative and careful one. And we are trained to be very careful and not impose our values on our clients. And certainly for the first decade, maybe two of practicing, I think it's much better to practice that way. I feel confident that I can be a real human being with
Yeah.
my client in the room. And I have said this, I think, with every client I've worked with, certainly in the last 15 years. Don't ever substitute my values for yours. My understanding is that this is what you want. You're telling me that this is what you plan on doing. Here's how I imagine that going. You choose your path. And then sometimes the dialogue will come back to me. It will volley, and the client will say to me, okay, well, if that's not the course of action, what would be a different course of action?
Right.
I am not a service provider who is going to sit and allow my client. I'm not going to be mute. I'm not analytically trained, even though NYU was a psychodynamic school. I'm not analytically trained. And I think for me, I am not saying that other therapists should practice this way because I could see this going bad a number of ways. But for me, I feel confident that I can tell my client, disclose a thought to my client without the risk of the client doing. My clients are so strong-willed, they would never do something
Right.
that was misaligned with them. And I also think that I have desperately needed therapists throughout my life to tell me when I'm headed in the wrong direction or to share their thoughts with me on my way of thinking through something. And in the void, because it was rare that I got that direct feedback, I I funded a Hamptons house or 2, and I wasted years of my life.
Yeah.
I don't wanna say wasted, but the change could have happened so much faster. I don't believe we're as influential as our profession has trained us to believe that we are. That, when we don't worry that we're gonna send our kids to school 0 to 12, and then they're gonna need teachers for the rest of their lives. We don't worry that we're
Right.
fostering dependence that way. You go to an accountant, you have a problem, the accountant shares their thoughts. You go to a any service provider, they share their thoughts. I feel confident that I can share my thoughts in a clean enough, ethical enough way that allows my clients to get through the process of therapy and fire me quicker. So that's
So
me.
I agree with that. No, I agree with that. And I think there's a difference. What I'm hearing you say is that when you hear someone straying from what they've articulated to you that they value or what they want for themselves, that you feel comfortable, you feel confident in the therapeutic relationship, you feel confident in your skills as a therapist to to articulate that what they're saying is seems misdirected based on what they've previously told you is important.
Mhm.
And I think that that is different. And maybe I'm just nitpicking here from a therapist bringing, like, using their own values, not necessarily the client's values, to say, I
Right.
think you should do this, or I think this person is a bad person, or I think you should break up with this person. I think that's when
Right.
it becomes harmful because
Mhm.
therapy shouldn't be a friendship, right? If you want someone just
Correct.
to tell you their opinions on things, contact a friend. And so I think where it's harmful is when a therapist starts to impose their own values or pressures someone to do something or to talk about something in a
Yeah.
way that isn't aligned with the goals and values that the client has already expressed.
And I don't think that someone brand new out of school can see that nuance that you just articulated.
Yeah.
And that is why we're trained to be more cautious, to be
Yeah.
dialed down verbally, um, especially early
Yeah.
on. So I think we both agree with your sentiment on that. Let's talk about access to therapy. How can
Yes.
people with limited funds or bad insurance still find quality therapy?
Yes. So I have 6 recommendations that I can kind of go through that I walk people through anytime they tell me I can't afford therapy, my health insurance doesn't cover therapy, or my health insurance is just bad. So the first is a sliding scale. So not every therapist provides a sliding scale, and the degree of sliding scales vary quite a bit. But a sliding scale is essentially a range of prices that a therapist will accept according to a client's income or financial ability at that moment, right? So whenever contacting a therapist, asking them whether they have a set fee or whether they accept a sliding scale. Outside of the traditional private practice therapy, there are 2 big options that people typically doesn't cross anyone's radars that I highly recommend. The first one is a training clinic. And I know people might roll their eyes at me and say, like, why would I
No.
want to go to someone in training? A lot of doctoral programs will have in-house training clinics where people getting their PhDs, several years into their PhDs, who
Yep.
might, by the way, at a certain level have more training than a lot of the master's level
100%,
clinicians.
because to get into your PhD program, you often need, well, at least in my program, they wanted decades of experience before they would even let you into the PhD program.
Yes. So these are students, but students with a lot of training and experience who are supervised by licensed psychologists or licensed clinicians who will, as part of their training, see people for free or at like $5, $10 an appointment. That's something that doesn't get looked at all, but I think is a very viable option because you're seeing someone for a low cost and that person's being supervised by someone with decades of experience.
Yep.
The other one that some people are surprised by, that I think for some people can be a really good option, is therapy studies. So many hospitals and universities offer free, high quality and short-term therapy for specific disorders. So let's say they are trying to study PTSD or depression. They will offer completely free, and in a lot of cases, you actually get paid as part of it. And that shouldn't be a coercive reason to do the study, but to get 8 sessions, 10 sessions, 20 sessions of therapy specifically for a disorder as part of their research. So I think that can be a good option for someone who wants targeted treatment, who's searching for a longer term therapist, or someone who's new to therapy and wants just to dip their foot in the, in the pond to see. Outside of that, there are 3 options to try to pursue with insurance. So the first is a super bill. And I will say that a super bill is something that's only viable for people who have a PPO insurance plan or some other insurance plan that has out-of-network benefits. But what a super bill is essentially an insurance-friendly bill. So you pay the therapist out of pocket, and I want to acknowledge that not everyone can do that, but you pay the therapist out of pocket, and they are able to provide you, typically monthly, an insurance-friendly bill that you can then submit to your insurance through a portal or a website or an app or whatever it is that that insurance company has. And the insurance company will reimburse you for a portion of it. That portion vastly differs according to your insurance plan and who the insurance is. But that can be a viable option for some people. Some insurance companies, it's up to 80%. And I have a document actually that I've created to help people navigate the specific questions that they can contact their insurance company with to find out, will you reimburse? And if so, how much? Because it's something that people should know before entering into therapy. 2 other quick options. One is called a single case agreement, and one is called a prior authorization. So a single case agreement is essentially when a therapist agrees to be in network with an insurance company for a specific client. So let's say someone who doesn't take any insurance, but there's someone who really needs their care. They can then create a single case agreement, which is essentially an agreement, a contract with the insurance company saying, even though I'm not in network with your insurance, I will see this person as if I were in network. So you can always ask someone, will you do a single case agreement? And then the last one is a prior authorization, in which, again, you would talk to a potential therapist about it. And if you were looking for specialized care for a specific disorder, for PTSD, for OCD, for something else, and you can't find someone in network with your insurance who specializes in that, you can go to your insurance company and say, look, I can't find anyone. Here's someone who is an expert in this disorder. Will you give a prior authorization? And what that is an agreement that the insurance company will reimburse the therapist fully, will reimburse the therapist their full fee, but will not put any of the financial burden on the client so that they're able to get that specialized care without incurring any of the exorbitant cost often that it requires to see a specialist.
But you're saying
So I
that
know
the
that was a bunch of
therapist,
different options.
no, it's great. It's great. I'm gonna see if I can list those as well in, or I'd like to link to that form if that's possible, Sarah.
Yes, I'm
Can I
more
do
than
that in the
happy
show
to.
notes?
Yes.
But what I hear you saying with that last option is that the therapist then waits on their payment. The therapist and the insurance. I'm not complaining. I'm not bitching. I just want to clarify.
It can be done both ways. So either the client can pay out of pocket with the agreement that they will be reimbursed retrospectively and in full, or the clinician will be reimbursed retrospectively and in full. I've only done it once. And during that instance, I chose to be the one to get the delayed payment because I knew it wouldn't be viable for the person to see me if they were having to pay, my cost out of pocket. So yeah, there was a delay, but I felt confident that there was this contract in place that the insurance would be paying me back.
What's the most common mistake you see people make when they're looking for a therapist, and what should they avoid and what should they do instead?
So there are three that immediately stick out to me. The first is looking for someone who conducts a specific type of therapy without reading about the therapy or considering why they want that specific therapy. I think that in the Instagram world, in pop culture, these terms get thrown around, and
Yep.
because people are hearing them, they decide that that's what they want. So when someone contacts me and says, can you help me find a therapist? One of the questions I ask, I have curated at this point a 10-question questionnaire that I send people. They send me their responses, and then I go to work contacting therapists, making sure they're legitimate and finding matches. And people will say to me something like, I want EMDR for OCD. And I'll
Mhm.
say to them, can you tell me why? And they just
Yeah.
say, I've heard EMDR is helpful. Not, I've heard it's helpful for OCD. I've heard
Right.
it's helpful. Right. So I think one of the biggest things is not just clinging on to these it's not a pop culture term, but to what they hear
Right.
in the general media, but making sure that they do their research. I can also send this to you to link if you want a guide to different types of therapy that if people are new to therapy, they can look through it and think what resonates the most with me or with whatever I'm struggling with. So I think that's the first thing, not looking into ahead of time, what do I want and do I have a clear reason for why I want it? I think the second one for those who want virtual therapy is only looking for therapists in the city that they live in.
Right. Because the beauty of virtual is that geography is
They can
not
be
a
anywhere.
constriction.
Right. So I think that that's a big one. People will say, I want a therapist in Boston, in Manhattan, in wherever they are. And if they don't want in-person therapy, it's likely actually to their benefit to be looking in slightly more remote areas where there might be less demand for therapists, and therefore more therapists might be available.
Mhm.
And then I think the third is looking for therapists that they feel would be their friends, right? People will often describe to me, I want a therapist who, and describe their exact demographics, right? I want a therapist who is in between 38 and 40 years old, which, first of all, I'm not going to ask a therapist how old they are, and I can't tell that type of thing, and matches their exact demographics.
Right.
I will say that the exception to what I'm about to say is marginalized populations are the exception to what I'm saying. But
So if I'm
research has
gay,
shown,
it's reasonable for me to look for
that,
somebody who's in the
right.
LGBTQ plus community.
Right. But with the exception of marginalized populations, no research suggests that shared demographics between a client and a therapist make a significant difference in terms of the effectiveness of therapy. And I will say there are caveats to that, right? Because if someone is like, I'm on the younger side, I don't think a 70-year-old is going to relate to me. I think that's fair, and there are the extremes. But I think
Mhm.
it's also important to recognize that someone who you want to be their friend might not be the best match for you in terms of a
Right.
therapist, right? So asking who is going to push me and trying to be more open-minded than thinking I want an exact replica of my best friend.
Right. I agree with that. I also will say that, it doesn't matter who comes across, like, you could match my demographics exactly. I'm still going to need you to fill in gaps because you have a lived
Totally.
experience that are completely different than
Totally.
mine. I understand why people would want similar demographics because it feels to them as if there's going to be less of they're going to have to fill in less subtext, but they're still going to have to fill
Yeah,
in subtext. We always have to be educated by our clients to a certain extent about their story and
totally.
what it was like for them because, we even know this with siblings. You can have two siblings living in the same house, same parents, totally different lived experiences. So each of
Totally.
those siblings is going to have to fill us in on what it was like. Because if you ask my brothers what it was like growing up in my house, it was very different than what it was like for me, in part because it was a decade earlier than when I grew up in
Right.
my house.
Right.
Sarah, this has been such a great conversation. I am so, so grateful for you and for your time. Where can people learn more about you? And can they reach out to you if they need help finding a therapist?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I run right now a free service of helping people across the US and Canada find therapists. So anyone can reach out to me for any help finding a therapist. You can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is _therapist. So that's S as in Sam, ARAH, P as in Peter, IST. You can also visit the website therapist.com. Again, SARAHPIST.com, where you can send inquiries for help finding therapists. You can sign up for the book club. You can access the guides that I've mentioned today on the different types of therapies, how to inquire about a super bill, and different ways to access mental health care. And I wanted to thank you so much for all that you do. I know we've spoken before, and I so admire your bluntness, your wisdom, your perspective, and all that you do.
Oh, thanks so much, Sarah. I've really enjoyed this. In a world riddled with bullshit and people in lanes that they have no business being in, you are so legit and you're going to heaven, man. The work that you do is just,
Thank
it's
you.
so beautiful, it's so generous, and it speaks to who you are on the inside. That's so
Thank you.
important. So thank you for what you do. We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering is by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trendy Music. Special thanks to Amanda Cristiani and Robin Genshin. If you know someone who's been frustrated by their search for a therapist, show them some love and text them this episode. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks that you have come to expect. References are always linked in the show notes. We'll see you soon.